All right, let's talk about English settlements in North America. Previously, we've talked about European colonization of the Americas, just generally between the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. But now let's look a little bit closer at English settlements. A little bit of a review here. The first groups in the New World was, of course, Spain and then the Portuguese. Now we're moving right along to the English settlements. These are some of the things we're going to talk about briefly. The first attempted English settlement at Roanoke, Jamestown, which will become the first permanent English settlement in 1607 in Virginia. Talk about the early troubles at Jamestown, and then how they basically came out of those troubles by developing a tobacco crop, the first cash crop in the Americas. Bacon's Rebellion and the beginning of slavery, African slavery, in the New World. Then we're going to shift focus, talk about the Puritans and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and end with the Salem witch trials. Okay, so this is Sir Walter Raleigh. The reason we're talking about him is because in the late 1500s, he is going to be the man responsible for the first attempt for the English to colonize North America. He will not be successful. England's first attempt to plant a colony in North America at what is now Roanoke Island remains a mystery. After one failed attempt in 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh dispatched a second expedition in 1587 under the captain John White. Now they landed at this island, they built a fort, and then John White sailed back to England to get supplies. They did not have enough supplies at this new settlement, and he said he was going to be back the following year, except he didn't come back for 2 years. So when he returned in 1590, White found the settlement completely empty. The colonists had basically vanished. The word Croatoan, which you see on this tree here, was the only thing that was left behind. Now, Croatoan is a name of a Native American tribe. No one really knows what happened to these first colonists, these first English colonists in the New World. Historians believe that perhaps the colonists starved to death or were either attacked by or joined with local Native American tribes. This is the first attempt to colonize the New World. It is not the first successful attempt. The first successful attempt is going to be in Jamestown, which is located in the Chesapeake Bay right here. Now, this first colonization attempt is going to be carried out by a private company known as the London Company, also known as the Virginia Company. Now, we call the first settlement Jamestown because it's named after this guy right here, King James I of England, who succeeded Elizabeth I, who succeeded the famous Henry VIII. So a little bit of background here. Elizabeth I was known as the Virgin Queen, and that is why this territory is known as Virginia. And then right down here, this is the James River, and the settlement of Jamestown is obviously named after King James I. So anyway, this company, the Virginia Company, had one real goal in mind as when they came to colonize here, and this was to find gold. And this desire to find gold is going to create the first set of problems the colonists are going to face when they arrive in the Chesapeake Bay. Obviously, one major problem is there isn't any gold, but the other problem is the Virginia Company is sending the wrong kinds of people to this area, people that are not fit to survive. These are young, unattached, mostly men, mostly employees of the company, and many of them have a criminal past. And although these are not the lists of the original people transported to Virginia, I wanted to show you this list just to show you the nature of the difference of people who were going to settle in the Chesapeake and Virginia near Jamestown and people who are going to settle north in the Massachusetts Bay area, New England area. And the first thing that should stand out to you is, of course, there's many men going to Virginia, and they're mostly young. Whereas on the other side, those going to New England, they were bringing their families. You see children, you see people of different skill sets, a weaver, a tailor, a farmer, and so on and so forth, a shoemaker. So the people settling in Jamestown generally were looking to go there to make some money and go back home. The people settling in New England were bringing their families, and they were far more prepared for a permanent settlement. Okay, so the Virginia Company sent their ships, Susan Constant, Discovery, and Godspeed, with nearly 150 passengers and crew members aboard. And they reached the shores of Virginia in April 1607. They slipped into a broad coastal river, which they named the James River, and sailed inland until they reached a small peninsula. There, the colonists claimed the land as theirs. They named the settlement Jamestown, and as I mentioned, they named the river James in honor of their king. This is another problem, that they located their camp, this settlement, on basically swampland, very low land surrounded by water and marsh, and it's going to have a disastrous effect on their health, especially in terms of the mosquito population that was here carrying malaria. It's going to get a lot of people sick. This is what the Jamestown camp was expected to look like. It obviously is a triangle format, has these rounded bulwarks and watchtowers mounted with cannon at each end. The cannon could shoot about a mile, which is pretty impressive. The walls of the triangular shaped fort measured about 420 feet on the riverside right here in front, and then 300 feet on the other two sides. And so the colonists lived in here and basically lived in these houses around the perimeter of the camp. Okay, so when these settlers arrived here, they were looking to find gold. They did not find gold. It was a complete disaster. They were ill-equipped and not prepared for survival at Jamestown. They lacked access to fresh water, and they refused to plant crops. So you're not going to be surprised that they quickly died. And by the end of the winter, only 9 months after they arrived, only 38 out of the 150 traders were still alive. Here's a quote describing how bad it was. Thus we lived for the space of 5 months in this miserable distress, our men night and day groaning in every corner of the fort, most pitiful to hear. If there were any conscience in men, it would make their hearts to bleed to hear the pitiful murmurings and outcries of our sick men for relief, every night and day for the space of 6 weeks, some departing out of the world, many times 3 or 4 in a night, in the morning their bodies being trailed out of their cabins like dogs to be buried. Now, into this grave situation enter John Smith. He's basically going to save the Virginia colony single-handedly. Now, John Smith was an adventurer. He was a warrior. In 1600, at age 20, Smith trekked across Europe and helped Hungary fight a war against the Islamic Turks, and for his heroic actions, he was even granted knighthood by the Hungarians. Now, Smith is basically James Bond of the 1600s, and he was one of the first settlers at Jamestown. And in the winter of 1607, when there were only 38 colonists who remained alive, Smith took control of the Virginia colony, and he instituted a new law. He said, "You see that power now rests wholly with me. You now must obey this law. He that will not work shall not eat." And Smith held the colony together by forcing the colonists to farm. He also persuaded the nearby Powhatan Indians to provide food. Of course, you've heard the story that, John Smith, was saved by Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan chief. That is true that he was saved by her, but she was young. She was only like 14, and he never married her. She actually married a different settler named John Rolfe, who we'll talk about later. And in fact, John Smith was not at the Virginia colony very long, because unfortunately, later in the same winter in 1607, A stray spark ignited a gunpowder bag Smith was wearing and set him on fire. And so he was badly burned, and he headed back to England, leaving Jamestown to fend for itself. Now, in the spring of 1609, settlers kept on pouring into Jamestown. 600 new colonists arrived with hopes of starting a new life in the colony. And it's still going to be a struggle. In fact, in the spring of 1609, they sent 600 people. By the end of that winter, only 60 of them were alive. And they actually called that winter the starving time, and the colonists had no food. They were eating anything they could. They ate roots, they ate rats, they ate snakes, and even boiled the leather that made their shoes to have something to eat to survive that winter. And most of them did die. Another negative thing that happened to the colonists is that the Powhatans became alarmed at the growing number of settlers that were arriving that spring, and they began to kill the colonists' livestock and destroy their farms. So by the following winter, conditions in Jamestown had deteriorated to this point of famine, also thanks in part to Indians sabotaging their food supply. Okay, so we need to talk now about how the Jamestown colony actually survived, and that's going to be thanks in part due to this crop here, tobacco. Now, Europeans had become aware of tobacco soon after Columbus's return from the West Indies, but the problem was most people didn't smoke it because it was too harsh. So the man to fix this problem was another Jamestown colonist by the name of John Rolfe. This is the man who married Pocahontas. This is Pocahontas here. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But John Rolfe, he basically began experimenting by crossbreeding tobacco. He crossbred tobacco from Brazil with a harsh strain of the local Native American tobacco that they had been growing for years. And Rolfe's experiment resulted in a high-quality tobacco strain, which the citizens of England soon claimed. So by the late 1620s, colonists at Jamestown exported more than 1.5 million pounds of tobacco. It was so profitable that tobacco became known as brown gold. And people in Europe, they smoked it, they snorted it, and they chewed it. They were hooked by 1820, and it set off an economic boom in the Chesapeake region. By 1640, they were exporting more than 3 million pounds, and by 1660, it had more than tripled. They were exporting 10 million pounds annually. Still, life was still harsh in the Chesapeake region. There were still few women, lots of death. 60% of parents died before their kids turned 13. Malaria, as I mentioned, was still a problem. Just to give you a sense of how hard life was, even in the now successful settlement at Jamestown, by between 1622 and 1640, 15,000 people arrived in Virginia, but the population only grew by 6,000, from 2,000 to 8,000. So it was incredibly treacherous, incredibly dangerous. The final point I want to make on tobacco is that it was the tobacco crop that poisoned the relationship between the Powhatan Indians. The Powhatan Indians became convinced that the English came not to trade with them, but to invade and take their land. And in 1617, the Virginia Company promised 100 acres of land to every free man that came and settled there. And so this is going to lead to the Indian Revolt of 1622, which we will discuss in detail in the next lecture.